Good morning. We have come to the book of Isaiah, and I cannot tell you how excited I am to talk about the book of Isaiah with you. I've spent the last, nearly 3 hours trying to map out what I'm going to say in these couple of videos and trying to work out what are Isaiah's greatest highlights, and I'm really struggling because it's all good. So what I'd really like to do is give you a kind of a 10-hour session on Isaiah, but I promise I'm going to resist that temptation. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about biblical prophecy in general, and give you a bit of a comment about Isaiah's times, and then I'm going to cover the first few chapters, a few of the highlights from there, and then tomorrow I'm going to show you, give you a tour of the rest of the book and make one or two more general comments. That's the plan. So I don't know what you think of when you hear someone speak about biblical prophecy, and we very often tend to think of that as being a foretelling, a telling of the future. Actually, the majority of biblical prophecy is more like narrating on the times, or possibly commenting on the immediate and foreseeable future. That's not to say that these prophets weren't sent by God, because they most certainly were, or certainly saw their understanding as being sent by God, and the Bible views them as being sent by God. But they are much more interested usually in saying things that are explaining the times to the people, or talking about immediate events that are on the immediate horizon. Sometimes they have their eyes set a little further than that. I'll try and show you some examples of that. Prophets in the Old Testament, when we think about the prophets, we often think about Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi. I think I got them all. These are called the writing prophets because we have a written account of their words. But actually, there's a lot more prophecy in the Hebrew Bible than this. And I've shown you one or two examples as we were going through. For example, the prophet Micaiah, when we were in Kings, I think it was 2 Kings 5 or 7 or something. We looked at that as an example. So prophecy was sometimes just spoken, and we may have a slight record of that in a narrative, or we sometimes clearly don't have a record of that. Prophets were generally male, but sometimes female, although none of the writing prophets were female, as far as we can tell. Prophets operated either on their own or in a kind of guild. They were official or unofficial. Most of the true prophets, the ones that God had truly sent, were unofficial. They kind of operated from the periphery. And one of the main things that a prophet has to do is speak truth to power. And it's very hard to speak truth to power when you are in the pay of the king, as I think I may have spoken about when we talked about that Micaiah passage. Prophets were sometimes based in the temple, sometimes based in the palace, but not very often for that reason, and often were itinerant. Sometimes they operated in their own home place, and sometimes they operated far from home. So the prophet Amos, for example, was from Judah, from the southern nation, and operates in Israel, in the northern nation. We'll talk about that when we get to him. Now, prophecy is always intended for a particular audience at a particular time. And we will not understand prophecy if we just try and kind of lift it up, decontextualize it, and drop it into our own situation. It won't make any sense to us, or the sense we think it makes will be misleading. So what we have to do, as we have to do with all of the Bible actually, but particularly with the prophecy, is we have to say, what was the prophet saying to his own audience? And then when we've heard what the prophet was saying to his own audience, we can start to ask the questions of what might God be saying through this to me today. Let me just say a little bit about what you find when you read the prophetic books. You have a combination of styles of writing. Broadly speaking, prophets seem to have spoken in oracles, and an oracle is kind of a single sermon or a single kind of utterance which stands alone. Sometimes they are gathered thematically, but the ordering of things within a prophetic book is not necessarily chronological. In fact, it quite often isn't chronological. So, there is an ordering, There is a logic to it, but it isn't very often a chronological or not a tight chronological order. And that's, I think, an important thing to bear in mind. If we think about prophecy more generally within the ancient Near East, so in other words, within the other nations around Israel, most prophets in that context were a professional class. They served in the temple. They were viewed as a mouthpiece for the gods. The prophetic role overlapped with the something called haruspexy, or soothsaying. So a soothsayer would do one of a number of things. He might ask the person who wants his fortune told, as it were, to burn some incense, and then he'd look at the pattern of smoke as it rose, and he'd foretell he kind of cast almost like casting a horoscope sort of thing. Or he would look at the entrails of a sacrificed animal. So if a king wanted to know if he should go to war, he would go to the prophet and say, or the haruspex, and say, "Can you tell me will I be successful?" And the soothsayer will kill the animal. He'll cut it open and he'll look at the relative size and position of the different organs, and then he'll foretell whether the king should go to battle or not. If you go to the British Museum, and I know I sound like I live there, kind of sometimes wish I did, you can find little clay models about smaller than the palm of my hand, most of them, of an animal liver. And they've got little sort of markings on them. And this was not a textbook, but like a chart for comparing the liver of the animal they've just sacrificed with, and if it's enlarged there, then I map it to this chart and it means this sort of thing. So it's quite interesting. Now, this form of prophecy, of soothsaying, was absolutely forbidden in the Hebrew Bible. People were not allowed to consult mediums. They weren't allowed to consult the dead. They weren't allowed to cast fortunes in that way. And prophecy in the Hebrew Bible is understood as receiving a message directly from God, either by vision or by hearing it. And they communicated that, as I've already said, by means of oracle, by means of a spoken utterance. Also sometimes, and quite often with some prophets, with an enacted prophecy. And we'll look at that a lot more, maybe a little bit when we do Jeremiah, but certainly when we get to Ezekiel, we'll be talking about enacted prophecy quite a bit. Now, the prophets fall into three categories in terms of the time frame within which they're operating. There's the pre-exilic prophets. So these are the prophets during the times of the kings who, and you may remember me saying this before, are continually calling the people back to the covenant, and particularly the covenant as set out in Deuteronomy 28. They're continually calling them back to them and saying, come back to the covenant, be faithful to the covenant, because otherwise you're going to, this is why you're having defeats in battle, this is why you're having droughts and plagues and things, and in the end you will lose your land. So the pre-exilic prophets implore, cajole, berate, rebuke, threaten. They do anything they can in their rhetorical toolbox to try and turn the people back to God. The prophets who are operating in exile they do something different, and they are offering comfort. And there's a wonderful shift there from warning and warning and warning and warning, and then the people anyway end up going into exile because they don't pay any attention to the warnings. And then the message that comes from the prophets is a message of comfort, a message of God hasn't abandoned you, even though you deserve to be abandoned. God hasn't abandoned you, and he will restore you to your land. And then you've got the post-exilic prophets, the prophets who are operating after the people have started coming back. So in the time of Ezra and Nehemiah and so on. And we've spoken about them a little bit already when we looked at the stories of Ezra and Nehemiah. And we'll talk about them more when we meet those prophets in due course. But they quite often bring a rebuke against the people. Come on, smarten yourselves up, sort of thing. A couple of comments about poetic language, which might be helpful as we approach the prophets. They have their own particular way of speaking about things, and sometimes that language is a bit alien to us. So whereas in the narratives we've been talking about Jerusalem, The prophets speak about Zion, and Zion means Jerusalem, but it's Jerusalem charged with all its theological significance, so this place where God lives and where the temple is, and the place of blessing and so on. So if you read Zion, think Jerusalem charged with a lot of theological meaning. Now, I've spoken to you in the narratives about how the nation of Israel, which is the nation that came out of Egypt and took over the land of Canaan, eventually split, and then the northern nation became called Israel, and the southern nation was called Judah. In the prophets mix that language up a bit, which is confusing and frankly a bit irritating, but what can we do? So when they speak about Israel, they may be talking about the northern nation. They may be talking about God's people in general, which is kind of both nations. Or occasionally the language is used actually of Judah, which is really frustrating and really quite confusing. But anyway, so we need to, when we read about Israel, it's helpful to try and think what's being referred to here. And the other clue you might see is when you see the language of Ephraim. Ephraim was one of the sons of Joseph and became one of the tribes, but Ephraim is sometimes used as a name for the northern nation. So if you see Ephraim, think Israel as in the northern nation of the two. Right, that was some general comments about prophecy. Let me say a little bit of introductory stuff about Isaiah, and then tomorrow we'll pick up the rest. Some key themes in Isaiah. Isaiah has been described as the Romans of the Old Testament. In other words, it is so theologically dense and rich, and I would say absolutely glorious. So I can only give you some of the key themes because there are many. The truth, the growing, emerging truth, that the Lord is creator of the whole world and commands the obedience and the worship of the whole world. This is a growing theme that is very, very loud and clear in Isaiah. Isaiah is looking, I said that he isn't foretelling the future. Well, I didn't say he wasn't foretelling the future. I said that a lot of prophecy isn't foretelling the future. But Isaiah does have this grand vision, what we call an eschatological vision. I'm going to use that word from time to time in the videos that follow. So I'm going to just explain it here. Eschatology means about the end of times. It's about final judgment. It's about recreation, new heavens and new earth. And Isaiah has an eschatological vision. He has a vision of a new heavens, of a new creation, which will be perfect, which will be good, which will be peaceful. And we start to see some of that language in Isaiah. Something, of course, that's going to be picked up a lot in the New Testament. Isaiah talks a lot about Zion, about the role that Zion plays for the blessing, not just of the nation of Israel, but for the whole world. He speaks quite a lot about the Messiah in different ways. Isaiah has a very clear theology of God using and overruling the great superpowers. Now, we spoke about the three great, well, there was Egypt as well, but really in Isaiah's time, there were three superpowers kind of coming one after the other. First of all, Assyria, that took the northern nation of Israel into exile. Then Babylon, that took the southern nation of Judah into exile. And then Persia, which allowed the displaced people of Judah to come back. So Assyria, Babylon, Persia. And within the book of Isaiah, we encounter all of those being discussed. So Assyria is described in chapter 10, verses 5 and 6, as a rod that God is using to chastise the people in their land. In chapter 39, verses 5 to 7, he speaks about Babylon and how he's going to send Babylon to take them out of it as a fulfillment of the covenant threat. And then 44, verses 24 to 28, he speaks about Cyrus of Persia by name, and how he will set them free and give them a chance to go back and re-establish the nation. So one of the key theologies of the book of Isaiah is that God uses and overrules and judges all of these superpowers. They are under his authority. So who was this Isaiah who wrote the book? Well, if you know anything about the book, you probably will know that there is, if you may well have read it and know it quite well, but if you've sort of studied it from a scholarly point of view, then you will probably know that there's a lot of debate about who wrote it and whether it was written by a single hand or over a period of time by many hands. Now, I don't really want to get into that debate because I don't think it's particularly helpful. What I will say is this: Isaiah 1 to 39, I think people are pretty much agreed that this is the work of somebody called Isaiah ben Amoz, who actually names himself in chapter 1, verse 1. And that he is operating during the time of the Assyrian threat to Judah. So he's operating in the southern kingdom and he's watching the activity of the Assyrian Empire and he's explaining it and narrating it to the kings of Judah. Following on in Isaiah 40, it feels like we turn a corner. And many people think that this is a different hand written later. It is certainly addressed, most of it anyway, to a people who are in exile, and then indeed a people who are returning from exile. And I suppose the question that people grapple with is, did Isaiah ben Amoz look ahead into the future and write words of comfort for a future generation? Or was this somebody else? In the end, I don't think that's terribly important, because what matters is that we understand what the message was to the people for whom it was intended, and then what is the message for us today. So let me show you some of the greatest hits in the first 6 chapters of this book, because it is so rich at the beginning, and then I'm going to pick it up from chapter 7 next time. So Isaiah chapter 1. Hear, O heavens, listen, O earth, for the Lord has spoken. This is verse 2 of chapter 1. I reared children and brought them up, but they have rebelled against me. The ox knows his master, and the donkey knows his owner's manger, but Israel does not know. My people do not understand. So this could almost be a title for really the first 39 chapters, is Come on, how can you not know me, says God. How can you not know me? Even a dumb animal knows its master. And did you hear that language of Israel, which is being addressed to Judah? So that's what I was referring to. Let me have a look at, let me just show you something else in chapter 1 first. We're getting this idea that it's not good enough just to go through the motions of temple sacrifice, that God is looking for a heart obedience. Excuse me. Verse 11. Oh, if I pick it up from 10, he actually says, hear the word of the Lord, you rulers of Sodom, listen to the law of our God, you people of Gomorrah. Now, Sodom and Gomorrah were 2 cities, pagan cities, that were destroyed back in Genesis 18, I think. So he's not actually addressing this to people of Sodom and Gomorrah, but he's using that language as quite a pungent, it's name calling really to the people of Judah. This is what he says: the multitude of your sacrifices, what are they to me? I have more than enough of burnt offerings, of rams and the fat of fattened animals. I have no pleasure in the blood of bulls and lambs and goats. When you come to appear before me, who has asked this of you, this trampling of my courts? Stop bringing meaningless offerings. Your incense is detestable to me. Skip on a little bit. When you spread out your hands in prayer, I will hide my eyes from you. Even if you offer many prayers, I will not listen. And then why? Your hands are full of blood. And take your evil deeds out of my sight. Stop doing wrong. Learn to do right. Seek justice. Encourage the oppressed. Defend the cause of the fatherless. Plead the cause of the widow. This is what I'm interested in, says God, much less than I'm interested in you. Trampling my courts, as he says, with sacrifices. You see what I mean when I say Isaiah is full of greatest hits. I still haven't got past the first 17 verses. Right, chapter 2. Beginning of chapter 2, he says this. In the last days, and the idea of the last days can be anything from, soon to kind of the end of times. In the last days, the mountain of the Lord's temple will be established as chief among the mountains. It will be raised above the hills, and all nations will stream to it. So this is Zion. This is Mount Zion with the temple being, metaphorically, elevated above all the other mountains. All the nations of the world streaming to it, coming and saying, verse 3, come, let us go to the mansion of the Lord. He will teach us his ways. And then it says, the law will go out from Zion, the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. So this, now we're beginning to get this idea. Do you remember back in the call of Abraham? All nations on earth will be blessed through you, says God to Abraham. And Isaiah is picking up on this same idea that the function of the temple now is intended to be for the blessing of the whole world. And the whole world will be, metaphorically, I think, streaming to it, at least partly metaphorical, partly something else. And I'll talk about that tomorrow. And be streaming to it in order to learn of God. So the nation is there to bless the world. A very important growing theme in Isaiah. I'm going to move on to chapter 5. Let me read you the first 4 verses of chapter 5. And if you don't know it from Isaiah, it may be familiar from something you know in the New Testament. I will sing for the one I love, a song about his vineyard. My loved one had a vineyard on a fertile hillside. This is God being the loved one. He dug it up and cleared it of stones and planted it with choicest vines. He built a watchtower in it and cut out a winepress. Then he looked for a crop of good grapes, but it yielded only bad fruit. Now, judge between me and my vineyard. What more could have been done for it than I did for it? So why did it only yield bad fruit? So the vineyard, of course, is Israel, is the people of God. And this little parable which Isaiah gives here, of course, is picked up and extended by Jesus in the parable of the vineyard, which he gives in the Gospels. In Isaiah 6, Isaiah is commissioned, and it's a very well-known passage. You might like to have a look at it. There is this glorious theophany. He has this vision of the glory of God seated in the heavens, and his glory filling the whole earth. There's that theme again. And he realizes his own sinfulness, the sin of his own lips, and he says, "Woe is me!" And then he is purified by a coal from the altar, and he's given a charge. And his charge is this: go and tell this people, be ever hearing but never understanding, be ever perceiving but ever seeing but never perceiving. Make the heart of this people calloused, make their ears dull, close their eyes, otherwise they might see with their eyes, hear with their ears, understand with their hearts, and turn and be healed. I think this is sarcasm of a sort. His message is a message of judgment, but it is a message, and it's couched in these sarcastic terms, you know, heaven forbid that you should actually turn and listen to the words of God, sort of thing. These are words that Jesus picks up when he explains why he speaks in parables, but not, I think, with the intention that he is speaking deliberately to obfuscate, deliberately to confuse or to make people it hard for people to follow, but because people are blinded and deafened, and the function of one of the functions of the prophets is to draw attention to the fact that people have blinded and deafened themselves to God. That was as far as I was going to go today. I'm going to pick up tomorrow with a very well-known passage, the sign of Emmanuel, but I think that's enough on Isaiah for today, and then I'm going to try and fit all the rest into the video, into tomorrow's video. See you then.